Hello, everyone. Welcome to Morning Latte with the Buechlers. I'm Cynthia Buechler.
And I'm William Buechler. And thanks for being here today. Today we're going to talk about Senate Bill 763 that deals with chaplains in Texas public schools.
What exactly did the legislature do with respect to having chaplains? Because chaplains could always be volunteers, the same as any other volunteer, but how did this change that?
Yeah, it's an interesting law, and it's been controversial so far in terms of what's required. But basically, the new Senate bill, which is passed by the legislature and went into effect on September 1st of 2023, allows school districts to either hire chaplains, or as Cynthia said, they could have been in a voluntary role before, but they can serve as volunteers in a counseling role. So they can either replace counselors, or they might supplement the counselors that you have. And then another option is it's not required. So it's not a mandatory thing, but it is something school districts are going to have to, and school boards are going to have to look at and vote on.
What do you mean that schools are all going to have to deal with that? In terms of the schools, what are they going to have to do when it comes to that? Do they have to allow chaplains to be counselors in their schools?
Yeah, and the answer to that is no, they don't have to do it. So as I said, the legislation went into effect on September 1st of 2023. And what Senate Bill 763, which is now codified as Chapter 23 of the Education Code, it states that the school boards must make decisions by March 1st of 2024. So there's a 6-month time frame in there. And the school board, it can't be passive on this. They need to make a decision. So there's 3 things they can do. One, they can pass a resolution that states that where they're going to employ chaplains and use them in a counseling role. Second, it would be to use them as volunteers. Or the third option is just to say, we're not going to use chaplains in this counseling role. And when I say about counseling role, what the language of the Senate bill states that they would provide support services and programs for students. But in essence, like I said, it's really moving in. It's using religiously affiliated chaplains to provide counseling types of supports.
So, what actually is defined as a chaplain? Does the statute define what chaplain means?
Yeah, and herein Cynthia makes the point here that this is the crux of the concerns about this statute. It doesn't define who a chaplain is or what a chaplain is for educational purposes. There's no definition whatsoever. Furthermore, the statute doesn't state what support services or programs are. So that's going to be left to the discretion of the local school district. So that's going to be a bit of a concern, because normally when you think of chaplains in their role, it's within the military, within hospitals, within prisons. So I think that Cynthia and I have been watching MASH, if y'all remember the old, it ages us a little bit, but the old show MASH, where Father Mulcahy's in there, and he serves as a chaplain in the military. And basically, it's a denominational, religiously affiliated individual that might serve more of the population, but they're not there to proselytize or try to convert. It's just there in situations where it's difficult if somebody wants some type of religious affiliation. So in a war situation, if I'm a Catholic faith, I might not have access to a Catholic mass. So a chaplain might serve a spiritual or religious purpose. Same in a hospital, same in a prison setting. So now we're talking about having chaplains in public schools in this circumstance, and there's really no model to define that, and that's different from those other types of circumstances where chaplains are normally used. So again, that's one of the concerns that we see with this statute, and we're going to see moving forward, is it doesn't define chaplain, and it doesn't define support services or programs. So if we choose to do that, if your school district chooses to do that, and your board decides this is the route we're going to go, whether it's employing chaplains or using them in a volunteer role, you need to look at other models that are out there, particularly with kids to determine like how we're going to do this program for, how we're going to define it, and what kind of programs are we going to use.
Well, obviously, then I think it's going to be very important for us to get a definition of chaplain so we know what they're actually encompass. But the other question I have is if you do employ a chaplain as a counselor, do you have to make parents aware that their child is going to go to a chaplain for counseling?
Yeah, well, and that's a good question because it doesn't state that in the statute. But the statute really states the only requirement that we have is the criminal background check, just like we have with employees, contractors,
Attorneys.
volunteers, attorneys, yeah, everybody that we use on the school premises, right? We need to go through the criminal background check. So that's in place. The consent requirements aren't there, and that's really one of the legal issues that we're going to have to deal with because in all kinds of those counseling type phases, we normally seek parental consent. And here, I mean, you could see all kinds of overtones that could occur if somebody is atheist and they don't want them seeing somebody who's affiliated with a religious denomination. Or you might even have within denominations, you might have a child maybe of the Muslim faith would not want to see somebody of the Christian faith, or the family might have objections to that. Even within Christian faith, you might have an Episcopal chaplain, and a Catholic family may not want that kind of influence. So there's all kinds of considerations there in terms of getting consent, and also just consent to use a chaplain for these types of purposes. So for the most part, when a family has their child in school and they agree to see a counselor, or the child goes to see a counselor, that's a school counselor under the Texas certification rules. We don't have any of that here, and that's again one of the issues that we deal with. We don't have any types of certification issues because they're not falling under SBEC. They might fall under some kinds of requirements as far as their denomination is concerned, but that's different than what we have in the public school system. So yeah, that's one of the really gray areas that we're going to see moving forward.
I think another gray area that you're going to have also is that under the Open Records Act, they can get counseling notes. And so counselors' notes are subject to being released to the parent. They're always, obviously not to the general public, but a parent has the right to see their child's records, and that includes counseling notes.
Right.
This adds the layer of that it is a religious person, and what is the protection there? And so I find that to be an interesting aspect that we will probably be encountering as well.
Yeah. Another one, really, and that's interesting too. Just as we're talking about this on an evidentiary perspective, this is really getting into the legal realm. But when we do hearings or you do trials, there is, from an evidentiary perspective, there is a privilege in terms of speaking with somebody you believe is religiously affiliated. So if I'm a Catholic and I go to a priest and issue confession, you can prevent the priest from testifying in court on that because of that religious affiliation. So I could see that maybe somewhere down the line from an evidentiary perspective, it's like, how are we going to be able to assert that privilege, or the fact that they're employed by the school or volunteering at that school, does that waive it? So I mean, that's kind of an interesting legal issue I could see somewhere down the line.
Yeah, you're going to see the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act somewhat colliding with some of these other laws out there, and which one is going to take precedence is going to be intriguing. How are they going to be, if a school chooses to pay for or employ a chaplain, where are the funds coming from?
Yeah. Obviously, that's not going to come into play on the volunteer side of it, or if you choose not to do it. But yeah, if you choose to have chaplains as an employee, it's going to be what the statute says is that the payments would come through the school safety allotment, which I'll give, of course, by definition, that deals with safety provisions in schools. But as you know, there's all types of components of that school safety allotment. It can be used for different types of services or programs, for example, restorative justice, behavioral interventions. A particular concern here would be suicide intervention. And I would think most chaplains will say that they're not trained unless they have counseling types of backgrounds, educational backgrounds, or certification. They're not trained to deal with things like restorative justice, behavioral concerns, suicide prevention, particularly. So, from a liability perspective and all that, that would be a bit of a concern. But that's how the legislature has defined. This is where the money's going to come from to pay for these folks. Is going to be through your school safety allotment.
Is there any other legal concerns you think might pop up because of chaplains in schools?
Well, yes, I have a whole list here. I figured we'd
We
be talking
knew there
about
was one. You knew that was a softball that I just put up there for you.
Well, you can tell this is it's an unclear area, and there are a lot of questions, and we've been speaking to our clients about this. There have been a lot of questions, and I think when you go through this, whether you decide as a school district to employ chaplains, you're going to have to deal with your policy on that, and that's going to be your D policies dealing with employees. And if you accept them as volunteers, you're going to have to make some amendments. It's the G series that deals with volunteers. So going back to the point we made initially, there's so much vagueness with respect to the law and the definitions and the education and the training and the requirements and the oversight. There's so many questions on this. What you're going to need to do is deal with this through your local policy and then probably administrative regulations. So I know TASB has provided some input to some of the schools on local policies dealing with this. But I've seen so far, though, it's not real specific. So I think you're going to need to address a lot of this through administrative regulations. Some of the issues, let's just go through some of them. On my notes here, the consent we've already talked about. So the parental consent is going to be an issue. You're also going to have training, for example, with HIPAA. Okay, so we're going to have training on FERPA. We have all the letters being thrown out there, but HIPAA is another one because of the mental health concerns. So these folks would have to be trained on that because a secondary point is that if we include them as employees or we include them as volunteers, we're going to continue to have the immunities that we have, which is good. And for the most part, school educators or professional educators and volunteers are protected by immunities, but we have to have the proper protections and training in place to deal with that. You're going to have to define what a chaplain is. You're going to have to define what the educational requirements of the chaplain will be. We're going to have to define what kind of continuing education is going to be required for those individuals. You're going to have to do some level of training, I would think, on multidisciplinary type things. So they're going to have to understand behavior management, like the one I mentioned before, the suicide, the prevention type thing. So it's going to have to be some multifaceted training that goes just beyond their spiritual training as a chaplain. I do want to emphasize it. Chaplains are great folks. It's not that it's not that we're advocating one way or another, and this is going to be kind of a local determination that you make. But our question is, are they going to be qualified? Are they going to be proper for the local school district? A couple of other just bigger legal concerns. I talked about the evidentiary thing, but Cynthia and I have talked about this with respect to the First Amendment, separation of church and state. And I think somewhere down the line, somebody might challenge that, whether it's too intermeshed. We all talk about school prayer and that type of thing. Well, if we're actually hiring religiously denominated chaplains to come in, is there going to be a church-state separation issue there? So I could see some potential First Amendment issues there. And then, as I said, the thing about looking at the local policies is we got to make sure that they're being incorporated into our personnel policies or volunteer policies to ensure that our immunities exist.
And I think what's interesting about that concept that you talked about, obviously chaplains and religious leaders deal with a lot of people in very traumatic situations. So, I mean, that's part of their profession. But I do think the school environment is unique in the sense of the issues that they are dealing with and the the environment itself, the age of the students, the need to know how to address when we refer a student for services, when we determine this child may be at risk, all those factors that we work with and try to make sure that the students feel safe, the students, have a place where they can speak, and we're learning to try to shape their behavior too, and help them to have skill sets to deal with those issues. So I think this population is going to be different from what a chaplain normally deals with, simply because we're dealing within the educational context. And that's the important thing. We have many parents who have kids who have counseling outside of school, but when we provide counseling is normally when kids have something that's impacting them educationally. So it's a different animal than one thinks of, even with people. We take the chaplain out of it. Even a private counselor versus a school counselor or a special ed counselor, they're dealing with these issues as they pertain within the educational environment, which may be very different from the private sector, which may deal with a lot more of the familial issues, which would be something that a chaplain would do within the religious context. So we are unique in that sense of how we provide services, even from someone that is a counselor, licensed counselor, like the ones in our school setting. Our functions are different. The same as a lot of times providers in terms of speech therapy or physical therapy. Private is very different from when we provide that service within the school context. So I think those issues will all be amplified when we're looking at whether or not a chaplain now would serve in that role as a counselor and now be at school.
Yeah, and that's even in the counseling, when you get into the 80-20 stuff too with counselors, you look at this, you're going to have like job descriptions on that, because are we going to bring in a chaplain, and is that chaplain going to do scheduling? Is that chaplain going to be a chair of a Section 504 meeting? Those are different things that, in the public school, counselors deal with on a daily basis. That again, it goes to the 80-20 rule, but some of that's just really dealing with counseling, and some are some other activities that are dealt with. So we're going to have to define what those roles are.
And for those who are not as familiar with that, can you explain the 80-20 rule?
Well, the 80-20 is in terms of what they really, the 80% of their time has counselors, and that's state law, and it's in the policy, and there are some exceptions if the board looks at it, and it depends on your district, but 80% of the time has to be done actually of doing counseling duties, as opposed to some of these other types of administrative type duties that might fall within a counselor's job description, but that's required by law.
And that was a legislative session before.
Right, correct.
So we are looking at all those aspects within that world. So it makes it much more challenging to address those within that context, because we are very different. As I said, we're not just doing counseling. We still do a lot of things that don't fall within the realm of what somebody who is out in the private sector would do as counseling. Okay. And so combining that with somebody who has a religious background, and again, one of the things that we realize that chaplains aren't going to be able to do within the school context, which they would be on the outside of the school, is to try to promote a religious aspect. And so I think that's going to be very interesting as well.
Yeah, very much so. And much so. I think really in summary on this, it's going to be because it's an optional thing, it's going to boil down to, I think, just what your community values are, what your community and school district resources are. Because part of the reason this went through is because some of the smaller school districts may need additional kind of counseling support. And when it's broad enough where it says support services and programs, that allows local control and allows you to define what the role of the chaplain would be in the school district. So, and there are some groups of chaplains that don't think this is a good idea, and some think it is a good idea. So again, I think this is going to boil down to your community values, your community resources, and we'll just kind of see where we go from there.
One of the things I just asked is like, well, does the statute just let you do nothing? Yeah. Can a school just say, I'm just going to sleep on this, and hey, if I just don't think about it, it's not happening?
No, so definitive action has to take place by March 1st of 2024. So the school board recommendations are usually comes from administrative recommendations on this. So you can look into what your community believes, what would be appropriate for your school district, what resources are available, but you have to take action. Either yay on employing, yay on volunteers, or say, no, we're not going to do that. Now that action just needs to be taken by March 1st of 2024. It doesn't mean if you say no at this time, you can never implement it. You could always go back to the board somewhere down the line. You could have a resolution where you decide, okay, this is in the best interest of the school district to do it, so let's go ahead and do that. So the initial legislation here is just some decision as to whether we're going to adopt a policy needs to be done within the first 6 months. But that doesn't mean it's for eternity, so you can change that later on. And perhaps you make the determination that, yes, we're going to adopt a policy, we're going to use them as volunteers. It doesn't work for whatever reason, then you could go back and just say, we're going to change that policy, and our policy is going to be that we're not going to have that anymore. So there'll be some flexibility, but the initial component is please do it within the first 6 months.
So if we say no, though, like you said, then they can later say yes.
Yes.
So you have that option to change your mind as the board changes its mind.
Yeah.
My other question is, just for those who are not familiar with how boards work, does it need to be posted? Do you need an agenda item for
Yeah,
that?
definitely I would have an agenda item. And it doesn't say that a resolution is necessary, just that, some motion needs to be made. I would do it through a resolution. So yeah, so when the board, we would have to post it as an agenda item. A resolution differs from a motion where you just need a little more oomph to it, where you need a little more factual background. So if you've done resolutions before, they're usually a factual background and then a motion that kind of ties it all together. Real simple motions are just 1 or 2 sentence things where we move that so-and-so is hired, right? That's a simple motion. A resolution, really, there's a little more factual background that's required. So whether you're going to do it or not do it, I would do it probably as a resolution, but it would certainly need to be posted.
But it sounds to me like what you're also talking about is you really need to get the pulse of your community to see what your community is seeking to have done. It truly may vary, and we've seen it within the schools we represent. There is a lot of different opinions as to whether or not a school is going to have this on both sides. And so I really do think it's important you get the pulse of your community to know how you are going to go forward. You have till March 1st. I know there's holidays coming around, but I definitely would try to find out what way your community wants to go with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to also let them be aware of the potential litigation that may happen because of it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. The other thing, we say that you don't ever want to be a test case. Sometimes you just are, unfortunately. But if, it's new legislation again, so give it a couple of years. And if it seems like there are cases that address this, agency addresses it, or the legislature comes back the next time around and they address it again, maybe there's more clarity to it. So you can always adopt it somewhere down the line. If you think it's a good idea, but you're a little unsure at this point, you can certainly adopt it somewhere down the line.
And you can let another district be the test case. Well, let's have Mikey eat it. He'll eat anything. That'll work.
Mikey,
So,
that's a little.
That's I know. Only you and I would know that one. That's too old. So I think that all sounds good. We do want to make sure we make you aware that this is for informative purposes only. We are not giving out legal advice. If you have any concerns about this legislation, please talk to your own counsel so that they can address your specific factual situation. And again, we would also love for you to come to our Nelly conference, which is coming up December 6th, 7th, and 8th. It's going to be amazing. It's going to deal with behavior. It's going to deal with all these legislative changes. And it'll also deal with the biggest issues you have that always come about. And that includes your everyday problems that you have in school. So with that being said, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to you being with us the next time we are drinking our morning
True.
latte.
And I should say,
Cheers.
amen, sister, to this
Yes,
one. Right?
that's right.